Many of us during the Indochina War were deeply helped and assisted by Noam's writings and by his speaking, helping to explain to us how the war was being fought, unmasking lies of both our own government, and more importantly, I think, in raising deeper questions about the political, military, economic context of the war, and particularly of the nature of the military-industrial academic complex and the role that scholars played in defending the status quo and in supporting the war effort. Among Noam's books are American Power and the New Mandarins, which I think was a really fundamental book, at least for me, in terms of defining the role of the intellectual. The New Cold War, After the Cataclysm, and the Washington Connection and Third World Fascism.
Well, the discussion of the Cold War and the arms race tends to focus on the two superpowers and on their interactions, which is quite natural. You would expect that to be the case. Despite the partial breakdown of the bipolar system in the past years, there's no question that the two superpowers are still preeminent. Furthermore, they're each very threatening. Each of them is quite a good candidate for the Ayatollah Khomeini's Great Satan of the Year award. Each is engaged in a massive arms race, neither of which has any rational justification in terms of defense, but are justified in other terms. Hence, each society is becoming more threatening and will continue to do so. The societies are quite different internally, obviously. In fact, polar opposites along many dimensions. But their external behavior tends to be rather similar, violent and destructive, roughly in proportion to their strength, which is the general law of national states. And I don't think these two are exceptions. Furthermore, they're enemies, and if they decide to have a go at each other, as they may, that will no doubt terminate the experiment with human civilization. So it makes eminently good sense to pay attention to the superpowers when we're considering the arms race and the Cold War and what we can do about it. Nevertheless, it's misleading, and it can be very misleading. It's misleading. It leads to focus too narrowly on the interaction of the superpowers. And I think that becomes rather clear when we consider real concrete cases. There is no doubt that the danger of superpower conflict is considerable. In fact, I think myself it's very likely. Obviously, we want to stop it. We want to prevent it. We don't want a nuclear war to take place. It therefore follows that we ought to be paying attention to how superpower conflict will break out. How is it likely to break out? If we want to prevent a nuclear war, what we'll do is try to prevent the circumstances which will lead to the engagement of the superpowers in conflict. What are some of the cases where where a nuclear war could erupt? The cases that we should be concerned with, in fact, if we want to prevent this from happening. Well, for one thing, there are a couple of places in the world where there's active warfare going on. Two obvious ones, one Central America and the other Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union has 100,000 or more troops engaged in a war which is highly reminiscent of the American war in Indochina. It's horrendous in itself, and it's conceivable that it could get out of control and turn into a superpower conflict. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. As far as the Central America case is concerned, in El Salvador and Guatemala, where the United States is supporting basically Nazi-like regimes, which are carrying out mass murder, about 8,000 peasants killed in Guatemala last summer, for example. In those two cases, horrendous as the situation is, it's very unlikely to lead to superpower conflict because we're the only superpower engaged. As far as the Honduras-Nicaragua affair is concerned, the story may be quite different. There it's clear that the Reagan administration is trying to, and beginning to succeed in fomenting a war, an attack, basically Honduran attack, or an attack by the Somoza's National Guard based in Honduras on Nicaragua. And that could very well proliferate and expand. Sooner or later, Nicaragua may call for outside assistance, which would mean Cuban or possibly Russian assistance, which would give the United States the opportunity that it's been waiting for, I suppose, to move in directly with a blockade or other forms of intervention, and that could very well bring the superpowers into conflict. So that case is not only, again, horrendous in itself, but also extremely dangerous from the point of view of the question to which we're now limiting ourselves, namely the likelihood of a nuclear war developing. Still, still, these are the areas that immediately come to mind when we look at active fighting going on in the world, but they're not the cases, I think, which are most likely to lead the superpowers into conflict. The case that's most likely to lead the superpowers into conflict, and its very real danger, is in the Middle East again, and it has to do with the Israel-Arab conflict. Now, that came very close to causing a nuclear war, I think, last summer, much closer than a lot of people think. The Russian and American fleets were there in force in the eastern Mediterranean. Israel, which was certainly being backed all the way by the United States in the attack on Lebanon. Israel attacked Syria, which is a Soviet ally. The Israeli Air Force, in fact, killed Russian advisors. Israel regularly bombed several times, bombarded the Russian embassy in Beirut. It, in fact, occupied the Russian embassy in what was clearly a pure provocation when it invaded an almost completely defenseless city. This was all either backed overtly or else tacitly supported by the United States. It did not lead to a Russian response, but it could have led to a Russian response. Something comparable that I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that the United States would have accepted affronts and provocations of that sort without responding. If, for example, there had been, imagine a Cuban invasion of Guatemala or of Costa Rica, in which the Cuban Air Force killed American advisors and the American embassy in the capital city was bombarded and then finally partially occupied. It's extremely unlikely that the United States would have sat by quietly while that happened. In fact, when the first Cuban soldier landed, we probably would have bombed Havana or invaded Cuba or maybe bombed Moscow or something like that. We take it for granted that the Russians are going to tolerate affronts of a kind that we will not tolerate, and they do. They do out of a position of relative weakness. And we're lucky that they do, or else, again, as I said, we would have nothing to discuss. We would not be here to discuss the matter. But that can change, and I think it's not unlikely that it'll change in the next couple of months. It's not impossible that there'll be another war in the Middle East. If not this year, then the following year. The logic is clear, and it's sort of permanent. It's unchanging. The timing may change, but the situation remains the same. Israel is in a position where it simply, in the position of conflict that exists, Israel will not be willing to accept what it regards as a military threat anywhere near its borders. Its situation in this respect is rather like South Africa. It's going to have to be constantly disrupting its borders, preventing any military force from developing which could interfere with its own plans to incorporate and integrate the territories that it has occupied and probably others beyond. Furthermore, the economic burden of the military conflict is enormous for Israel. It's well over a third of its budget is now devoted to, of its gross national product, in fact, is now devoted to military expenditures. As you know, the Soviet Union has not only rebuilt the Syrian armed forces, but has in fact installed new and more advanced anti-aircraft missiles, SAM-5 missiles, which apparently have several thousand Russians operating them. And the Soviet Union has, according to the press, made very clear indications both to the United States and to Israel that it will not tolerate, whatever that means, an attack on the SAM missiles. If Israel attacks, they're going to kill Russians. It's possible that the Soviet Union may move in response to an attack on its ally and, in fact, its own troops. That would lead the Americans in, and at that point we have a global war. This is very close, I think. And again, it's a state of affairs which is persistent. You can't predict when it's going to break out, but you can be pretty sure that it's going to break out. It's persistent as part of the logic of the rejectionist position that the United States has adopted since about 1970. That is the position of supporting Israeli expansion and integration of the occupied territories. As long as the United States supports that position and backs it and provides the means for it, a situation of permanent conflict will exist, and with it the extreme likelihood of regular war, which will, as in the immediate past and as very likely in the immediate future, carries an immense risk of involving the superpowers. Again, quite apart from the effect on the people themselves, which I'm putting to the side here because it's not our topic. This is an extremely likely situation, a situation in which it's extremely likely that the superpowers will come into conflict. And there are other cases in that region. Nobody knows, of course, what's going to happen in the Iran-Iraq conflict. It's very unstable. Both superpowers are hovering around waiting to see what's happening. A major part of the American military buildup is aimed precisely at that area. The Rapid Deployment Force is aimed totally, in fact, now at the Gulf region. There's a circle of bases extending from eastern Turkey all the way down to the Indian Ocean, including Africa and African bases, which are aimed at the Middle East. The same is true of the missile systems that we're installing in Europe. I don't think it's very likely that the Pershing II missiles or the cruise missiles are really aimed at putting Russia out of commission or a first strike or anything like that. What they're aimed for is attack on command and control, apparently. What that means is that they're aimed at preventing the Soviet Union from interfering with an effort on our part to invade the Middle East. We want to ensure that if we're going to intervene in the Middle East, the Soviet Union will not have a way of deterring this. And we want to make sure that Soviet troops, for example, won't cross into, say, Iran, something which we would try to block with tactical nuclear missiles, and we want to prevent them from stopping our attack with their missile systems. Hence, we need missiles close by which are going to attack their command and control and so on. Of course, they can figure that out too, which means that if a situation of tension arises, there could very well be a Central European war as one or the other superpower decides to move to prevent its enemy from blocking its own intended interference or intervention in a region such as, for example, the Middle East. These are the kinds of interactions that are being planned for and that are being and for which the armaments are being built and developed. And they all relate to, they almost invariably relate to third world intervention, and I think very crucially the Middle East, which is of course an area of enormous strategic and economic importance, primarily for the United States because of the reliance on the petroleum resources there, but one in which the superpowers have been very close to conflict in the past repeatedly and may again be in the future. Well, what follows from these considerations with regard to our topic, I think what follows is this. The superpowers are enemies, and they're enemies for quite good reasons. In a sense, each of the superpowers fears the other for good reasons and also at the same time welcomes the other. Each fears the other because each superpower sees the other as impeding its own possibilities of intervening through direct aggression, through subversion, through interference of one sort or another in a region to which it hopes to extend its power and control. The Russians want a free hand in Eastern Europe and now in parts of Southwest Asia, and more if they can get hold of it. The United States wants a free hand in the Middle East, in the Western Hemisphere, in large parts of Africa and Asia. Each superpower has to deter the other. It has to keep open the space in which it can carry out its subversive and aggressive actions. In this respect, each power is engaged in deterrence, and each does fear the other as a force that may block its interference and intervention and subversion and aggression. From another point of view, each of the two superpowers needs the other as, and in fact welcomes the other as providing a means for ideological mobilization, for national mobilization at home. Intervention is a costly business. It's costly for the Russians in Afghanistan. It was costly for us in Vietnam. It's costly from a material point of view. It's also costly from a moral point of view. It's hard to bear in a certain sense. And it's any society, whether totalitarian or democratic or whatever, is going to have to mobilize its population. Is going to have to gain popular support for actions which are ugly and costly and difficult and often simply obscene. There's the standard way of doing this. Which is not just true of the United States and the Soviet Union, but much more general, and that is to mobilize in defense against a great enemy that's going to destroy you. And that, in fact, is the history of the Cold War. If you take a look at the Cold War, incident after incident after incident, whether it's the American coup in Guatemala or the Russian invasion of Hungary or the Russian support for a military dictatorship in Poland or our support for a military dictatorship in Turkey or go incident after incident from our intervention in Greece in the late 1940s, to the Russians sending troops to East Berlin, and all the way since. And every single case, without exception, has involved the intervention of one or the other superpower has been justified internally on the grounds that this is a means of defense against the great Satan, against the superpower enemy that's aiming to destroy us. And there's, of course, a small element of truth in these pictures, as there is in any propaganda system. But the picture has been very effective. It's been very effective in frightening the domestic populations and mobilizing them behind actions which are very destructive in many cases and which are also domestically extremely costly to much of the population in many cases. In this respect, each of the two superpowers needs the other. There's a kind of a functional character to the Cold War that keeps it going. It's useful to the leadership groups in the two superpowers. It's also necessary to mobilize the populations for domestic purposes. Each of the two superpowers, and others in lesser degree, has developed a system of national economic planning and development which is highly geared to military production. Now that's one of the easy ways for a state to intervene in maintaining so-called economic growth, but it's also one which is very costly for the population. It's obviously highly inefficient. It's mostly waste production. Somebody's got to pay for it. And the question is, how do you do it? Well, the way you do it is by frightening the population, frightening them into the belief that they're about to be attacked and destroyed. I think that there is clearly in the United States, and I think equally clearly in the Soviet Union, though the mechanisms are different, there are internal drives towards militarization of the society and militarization of the economy, and these drives do require domestic mobilization, and that domestic mobilization invariably will appeal to the threat of an external enemy. So what I think we have here is a very dangerous and threatening and unfortunate confluence of a variety of forces. Within each of the two societies, there is a drive to support the Cold War system. It's an extremely dangerous system. It's a system that's very likely to explode at any time, and the dangers become greater and greater with each passing year. Well, if this is correct, and I think it is, why do the planners on both sides persist in it? I think the reason has to do with the nature of policy planning, which tends to be short-term, both in business and in national planning and so on. My friend and colleague Ed Herman put it rather naturally and correctly, I think, when he said that the gains from an aggressive militarism are in the short run, but the threat of mutual incineration is more remote. I think that's essentially correct. Planners are thinking about the gains from aggressive militarism, which is in the short run, both in terms of the short-term gains of intervention and subversion, and the short-term gains of national mobilization for economic planning and development through militarization. The long-term likelihood of mutual incineration is remote, or at least they think it's remote, and hence it doesn't act as an immediate factor in planning. Here, the populations in both countries are quite different. The people in the Soviet Union want peace, and the people in the United States want peace, and the people everywhere else want peace. But in both countries, they're frightened into accepting systems of domination and control which are geared to war. That's true here, and it's true there. And that's the system that somehow has to be broken. Well, what can we do about breaking it? Clearly, we can primarily influence the policies that are undertaken in our own society. And in this case, that happens to be more than usually crucial, because it is quite correct that due to the greater power of the United States, we have throughout the Cold War period generally been in the lead in arms production, in intervention and subversion and so on. I think there are basically two thrusts, two directions in which efforts should be directed. One is the one that in fact is getting a good deal of attention finally, namely efforts to develop political pressures which will impede the creation and development of new and more threatening strategic weapon systems. That's surely important. In my view, it's of great importance, but probably secondary importance, secondary to concern over the question, over the manner in which superpower confrontation is likely to develop. Again, it is likely to develop through third world conflicts that grow out of control and that develop from tensions that we have been very instrumental in maintaining and perpetuating and sometimes creating. The most threatening of all is the one that I mentioned, the Middle East conflict, and their American rejectionism, that is the consistent refusal of the United States over many years to accept any form of political settlement, and many possibilities have existed. That refusal has led to a situation in which conflict is highly likely and involvement of the superpowers is highly likely. And in my opinion, if one wants to do something serious to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war, there's nothing more imperative than to focus on exactly that situation and change the American policies, which at every point have stood in the way of a political settlement which has been realizable. Pretty soon it may be too late to do that. In fact, it may be too late already, but we're certainly very close to the final point at which a policy change will simply be out of the question there. I think the time span for appropriate action on these issues is not very great, and in fact may be very short, and it's not in the least unlikely, in my view, that within a few months we may be facing an extremely threatening situation of exactly this nature.
You said a number of times that in different places the U.S. is working for economic growth. I mean, it's looking for economic growth through this wasteful arms buildup. And I don't understand exactly why it thinks that it can have better economic growth that way.
It's an old story. Since the 1930s, it has been crystal clear that every capitalist system requires significant state intervention in order to keep the industrial system functioning. You know, it's called Keynesianism, if you like, but everybody discovered it, whether they heard of Keynes or they didn't hear of Keynes or whatever. If you create demand, you can get the industrial system to function within certain limits. The easiest way for a state to induce demand is for the state to purchase, for it to build up a guaranteed market for production. Well, in a capitalist system like ours, a state intervention in the economy has got to be designed so that it does not interfere with the prerogatives of those who own the industrial system. So the state is not going to get involved in, say, producing automobiles, or in fact producing anything that can be sold on the commercial market, because that will interfere with the market system in which those who own the economy want to function and make their profits. So what the state has to do is figure out some way of subsidizing production. Okay, and in fact, in our society, that means subsidizing high technology production. The state has to figure out some way of subsidizing high technology production. The easiest way to do it is, in fact, the way that has been picked by us and just about everybody else who's fallen into this problem, namely to build up a state-guaranteed market for production of high technology waste, which means armaments. You know. So in fact, if you look at the Pentagon system in the United States supports research, it supports rising industries, it supports new technologies, and so on. And the way it does it is by creating a market for their production. It also supports research and development and so on directly. But the main way it does it is by creating a market for their production. Other societies are not dissimilar in this respect. We happen to have been committed to this to a much greater extent than many others.
If the American nuclear freeze movement and similar movements do succeed, let's say in stopping Pershing II, cruise missile, how do you think the Soviet Union will respond to this in your perspective?
I think an arms control agreement is possible. You know, it's possible because within the framework of an arms control agreement, each side will be able to pursue its growing militarization in its own way. You know, they'll adapt themselves to the arms control agreements. So, for example, it is no longer advantageous on our side, let's say, to have more and more missiles. What we want is the possibility of more and more sophisticated technical development. And I think you can guarantee that any arms control agreement that either we or the Russians will accept will allow indefinite technological development, you know, even with some bound on the number of missiles. And the reasons are because of the way in which this fits into the industrial systems and the driving the industrial systems towards subsidy for high technology and so on and so forth. Also because of the fact that they will continue to provide the deterrent threat that will allow each superpower the space to carry out its interventions. That's going to go on. Now, I think the Soviet Union would support an arms control agreement of that character, just as our side would, and therefore there might be a possibility for an agreement. I think it's a good thing. I think it's very cynical, but I think it's a good thing because it does reduce to some extent the likelihood that a nuclear war will in fact break out, say by accident or because tensions get too high or whatever. Still, I think it's a secondary factor. I think even if we had a serious arms control agreement, still it would turn out that if the superpowers came into conflict, there would be a nuclear war, and even if we had 10% or 5% the weaponry we have now, that would be so destructive that one doesn't want to think about it.
Okay, I think we need to end at this point. The one thing I would just kind of comment, maybe from another side of people that I talk to, is this kind of view of people in Harvard Square in Cambridge, and they come and they talk a lot, and then what do they go and do? And I guess I just want to lay on people as you leave once again the perspective of responsibility that our society does at least allow in a more open way for you to press for human survival, for you to press for peace, and I hope you take that opportunity and that responsibility seriously in the coming days and weeks.
Cambridge Forum has presented The Cold War and the Arms Race. Where do we go from here? Featuring Noam Chomsky. This forum was co-sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee.